What I've got up on the screen is two different historical characters. The first being obviously Jesus of Nazareth. The second is Emperor Tiberius, who was the most famous, the most well-known person during the lifetime and this period of antiquity that Jesus himself lived in. Both Jesus and Emperor Tiberius have four biographical sources that chronicle the exploits of their life. Jesus having Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Tiberius having Velus Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassio Dio. Now, here's what I want to do and focus on my area of academic study in terms of looking at manuscript evidence for these two characters. The reason I'm doing this is because when we look at the life of Jesus and we look at his biographical sources and we look at the life of Emperor Tiberius and we look at his biographical sources, we have a very close comparison. Both individuals are coming from the first century. Both individuals have four biographical source materials that we rely on to find the details of their life. Obviously, Jesus are the Gospels that we know of, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the closest in terms of time and geographical closeness to the life of Jesus. Tiberius, very similarly, has four, Velus Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassio Dio. They're very similar also in our earliest manuscript evidence for them. For Jesus, we have 2nd century for Matthew and John, and we have the 3rd century for Mark and Luke. Now, these are fragmentary. They're not full copies. They're just fragmentary copies because our earliest copies are fragmentary. That's just a reality of everything that is in the ancient world. The same goes for Emperor Tiberius. Velus Paterculus actually does a pretty good job because he's writing in the 1st century of the 1st century character of Tiberius. And our first copies in terms of the fragmentary evidence are from the 1st century. Tacitus and Suetonius come from the 2nd century. Cassio Dio is much later in the 9th century. However, even though Velus Paterculus is the earliest, he was a paid propagandist. So even though he's the earliest, even though our manuscript evidence is the earliest, he is the least trusted historically in order to present accurate biographical material for the life of Tiberius. Real change comes when we don't look at just fragmentary evidence, because I think if we just look at fragmentary evidence, we're looking at something very comparative with Jesus and Tiberius. Once again, the most well-known character in the ancient world, the most powerful character in the ancient world. If we skip over and we look at the first copies, Tacitus would refer to as functional manuscript in the sense of you open up and you have the beginning and then you go through right till the end. That's where Jesus actually beats Emperor Tiberius. For all of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we have 4th century evidence. Now, Velus Paterculus is writing, and his first functional manuscript, remember I said his first fragmentary evidence was from the 1st century, his first functional manuscript that we can actually read that's more than just a few scraps here and there, comes from the 16th century, Tacitus the 9th century, Suetonius the 9th century, and Cassio Dio also from the 9th century. What are we talking about here? Well, if we're talking about our earliest complete, that is cover-to-cover copies of the 4 Gospels, that number would be the 4th century. But for Tiberius, what that looks like is the 16th century, the 9th century, the 9th century, and the 9th century. So just on the documentary evidence alone, just on the source material for the life of Jesus, when we compare it to the most well-known, the most well-documented, the most powerful person in the ancient world during Jesus' time, Jesus is comparative. They actually even say that Jesus is marginally better. Why would I say that Jesus is marginally better? Well, Suetonius, Cassio Dio, Velus Paterculus, and Tacitus are not just focusing on Emperor Tiberius. They're talking about Emperor Tiberius, and they're also talking about other individuals. Where if we talk about the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we're just talking about Jesus. So the source material is much more rich, it's much more detailed, and it's much more filled out than the source material that we're talking about for, once again, the most well-established, most well-known, most important person during Jesus' lifetime. When we compare early source material, early biographical material of the most well-known individual in the ancient world with Jesus, Jesus is astonishingly comparative, if not marginally better.